When it came to Reasonable Doubt, the third season, there were a handful of main or rather major storylines. Of course, like with every season, there was the case of the season, of which for this one was child star Ozzie Davis allegedly killing his girlfriend Wendy. And like most of the cases when it comes to Jax, it's focused on a person of color, in this case a black man, who she finds herself kind of back and forth torn about. Ozzy is a child star who's trying to navigate his world, and he's somebody who's dealt with abuse, who deals with addiction, and of course, because Jax, as wonderful and professional as she is, she gets a little bit too close to her clients. There are some issues that get involved with her not only trying to help Ozzy stay clean and on the straight and narrow, but having her father named Eddie coming back into her life after he's experienced addiction and other issues. But alongside Jax's issues in the courtroom, she also has issues in the boardroom as Vince and Steven are trying to bring this man named Bill up and make him an equity partner against Jax's opinion of it. And there's a lot of other complications in terms of how the law firm is running, the future of it, and also what is Jax's place going to be once the dust settles. And outside of Jax, there's not really much in the way of storylines, but Lewis does get a major step up as it continues the Tony drama that we were introduced to from last season, and also gives us a little bit more workplace drama than we've seen before, allowing him to be more autonomous outside of Jax's orbit. Getting to the review section, the first highlight is a highlight that has been pretty much the series highlight in terms of Jax being someone who continues to live in authentically in a way that is inspiring not only for how she lives in her work life but also for her personal life. For her work life, it's a beautiful thing to see someone who's so unabashed, who's very much direct, even when she's in white spaces, and doesn't necessarily tone down who she is, but she definitely shows that she refined it in order to continue to be comfortable in some form or way while not having to pretend to be something she's not to make Steven or Vince or anybody in the room comfortable. And granted, it's definitely acknowledged that there was a time when she was like that, code switch and everything, but now she's wearing braids to work like she does. She speaks how she speaks. She makes it very clear what she brings to the table. There's no being humble to make other people feel comfortable, and you have to love, respect, and enjoy that so much, especially if you're a person of color, black person specifically, because the opportunity and ability to do that still can feel very rare, especially when you're not amongst people who are of your own culture or share a similar culture. And then when it comes to her personal life, I just love the fact that Jax, as professional as she is, and as much as you can see that this is definitely a show that is inspired and definitely drives the paved way that Shonda Rhimes made, Jax has not forgotten where she come from. She still very much speaks in authentic Ebonics. She, when it comes to Lewis, the way they talk to each other and with each other, it feels, it just gives you a sense that you don't have, when it comes to Jax, any sense of respectability politics. She doesn't have it at work, and she doesn't have it with her audience to make it seem like she is this person who is above it all, forgot where she came from, has climbed up the social ladder and pulled it up with her, but she still is very much somebody who can whoop ass and take names in the boardroom and throw down on some mac and cheese, collard greens, whatever, hang out with people, do spades, cuss up a storm, and still very much be respectable without having to seem like she was born, raised, in trying to adhere to some Cosby Show standard. Which leads to the next highlight, and that's what they did with Lewis this season. Because with Lewis and this whole drama with Tony, it wasn't looking good for him. And on top of that, Lewis has long been the hot husband when it comes to Jax. But this season, I feel like, really gave him a chance to explore beyond that. Like when it came to Tony, he was allowed to have his own scenes with Tony without Jax making her comments. And by allowing him to do that, we got to see him not only handle his part of the grief of losing a child, but also engage with Tony in a way that made it so you recognize that they did share something important in terms of a child and the devastation which comes from losing it. And I would say it did not just wonders for Lewis as a character, but also for Tony in terms of making it clear that she is not a villain in this. It's that she is a deeply wounded person because who Jax is, be it her pettiness or inability to understand people to a certain degree, that is what led Tony to go so hard against not only Jax but also Lewis. And then on the other hand, to something that's a little bit more lighter than the Tony storyline, you have Lewis trying to navigate having an employee like Sam who very much took advantage of Lewis, and Lewis trying to navigate wanting to mentor and bring up the next generation, especially of black men in his field, yet at the same time having the issue of when you try to of hiring skin folk you think is going to be kinfolk, but realizing that their only desires is to play the system to the best of their abilities, of which they have very few, if any. And I would even add in as one last thing, especially when it comes to the whole Sam situation, it also shows that this series recognizes that it's odd that Jax has 4 active friendships, if you include some of her staff, even more than that. Meanwhile, Lewis pretty much just has Jax. He doesn't have any male friends, since Chris, who's Sally's husband, is not really something he's cool with. And so pretty much his life revolves around his wife and his kids. And with his kids barely in this season, his wife often working on major cases, it really pushes you to see that Lewis needs somebody, because as shown with the Tony situation, he had no one to go to for that. When it comes to the Sam situation, yes, he can go to Jax to a certain degree, but she has her own work drama, which honestly, with the way the show is, sometimes is pushed to take precedence. And then when you add in what's happening with her family, it can make what's happening with his family, with his parents seemingly having marital issues, it makes it so it seems like he has to often set aside what's going on with him. And if he had a friend, as this season really pushed, maybe he could have at least parity, if not get to have more of a role where it's about what he's going through and not how he can play a role in what others are going through, especially in the terms of supporting and bettering what's their workload or stress. The next highlight bus is definitely going to be Ozzy, and that's just because after what Chanel did in the second season regarding her case, there was the worry, if not fear, that because the next person was not likely going to be part of Jackson's personal life, they wouldn't benefit from that time and investment that Chanel had. But when it comes to Ozzy, between him as an individual representing the rare black child star and trying to develop that storyline, added on to how Kyle Berry played him, it showed and definitely set a standard for season 4, which this was announced already, that when it comes to these season-long guest stars, they have to bring it much more than what we saw in first season. And on top of that, they have to bring a real sense of reasonable doubt, because with Kyle Berry playing Ozzy as an actor, there were definitely times when you had to wonder, could it be that Ozzy actually did this? And with that, it really made you see the layers to not only Kyle Berry as an actor, but also Ozzy as a character, especially as it became clear with Ozzy being 24. Yes, in many ways, he knows how to potentially manipulate people or make himself smaller so that they see him as vulnerable and weak. But at the same time, he's a 24-year-old that likes to party, do drugs, have sex, and knows how to play up his celebrity in order to get what he wants, leading to what hopefully is going to be the standard for this show and not just a one-off, if not something that we was able to get for season 2 and 3, and then we're left in season 4 with wondering what the hell happened. Leading to the next highlight, which is the season finale wasn't necessarily a huge jaw drop, but it definitely got you excited for what could come. For I think when it comes to the way Reasonable Doubt works, like a lot of shows of its ilk, they keep wanting to do a cliffhanger to make you crave more, to go on social media, start bugging the writers, directors, the studios, etc. But with the way that this season ended, it wasn't purely about the cliffhanger that could set up the next season, like we saw when Tony delivered those that lawsuit paper. It was also about creating storylines that actually would possibly last beyond the first 2 or 3 episodes in terms of where Jax is going in life. Not only that, where Crystal may go in life, considering even though her storyline was definitely downplayed, she still is studying for the bar and could potentially become not necessarily Jack's partner, but she could become an associate that works under Jax the same way we saw Bill work in this season. And then, of course, you have the fact that Daniel got used by Lewis in order to investigate some of Jax's family members, and he even had his own storyline when it came to Ozzy's sister Kristen, when she became his love interest, and he talked about his family. And all in all, a lot was presented in season 3, and it made it clear that while you could in some ways be satisfied with what we got this season, it had so many ideas for what more can be done, rather than putting everything into a cliffhanger where there's a sudden shock before credits and relying strictly on that to keep you interested and theorizing what could happen. The next highlight for us is that for whatever wasn't working in the show, it seems like it quickly got handled. Like, one of the things that we struggle with sometimes is that shows that are about 5-10 episodes, well, 6 or 10 episodes, it often seems that they're stuck where they are, and it's not until the season finale do things seem like they're gonna actually get better. And unfortunately, they can only get better if they get renewed for another season. However, with Reasonable Doubt, there were multiple things, or characters rather, that weren't working, like the character Chad, who was the original opposing counsel when it came to Jax's case defending Ozzy. He just, compared to what we got in season 2, he fell flat, and thankfully Mike got swapped in. On top of that, Sally's storyline was utterly trash, and thankfully, even though they tried to pair her with Bill to try to up her a little bit, at a certain point they decided, you know what, let's just tone it down, because she doesn't have the same oomph that Chanel has. She doesn't have that same warmth that Autumn has. Sally's just somebody who, in some ways, you can appreciate because she doesn't have that welcoming factor, but at the same time, she also doesn't have that love to hate factor to really make you want to see more of her, even if it's times of getting comeuppance or something like that. But we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But also, we have to mention that when it comes to Spence and Naima, I would say that them only having brief appearances was good enough. Yes, in the beginning it seemed like Naima may get more time, especially with Spence off to school, but then it seemed that they understood that they're not major hooks for this show. They have value to this show, but they're not something that keeps you coming back for more every week. So they dialed them back into what space they needed to be in, and it was very much appreciated, since too many shows present kids as a sign that 2 lead actors had sex, and it doesn't seem like those kids often have much purpose beyond that. Which leads to the last highlight, and that's just the soundtrack. Between this show and Forever, which came out earlier this year on Netflix, pretty much the best soundtracks, the kind that make you have to go to Spotify to see if there's an official one, or somebody came up and curated all of them together, because even just in the finale with Luke James' cover of Mad World, or the use of Always and Forever early in the season, specifically the Heatwave version, or Jill Scott, the use of the Thong song, Rihanna's Needed Me. Yes, a lot of it's more popular songs rather than like indie, like, you know, songs that your parents or grandparents knew from listening to the whole album, not just the hits. But it still, every time one of those songs came on, it just really showed you that this show is very much in touch with the culture it's trying to market to, and not just having a bunch of black and brown people on screen, but them pretty much being bland and colorless, which leads to the low points. And first and foremost has to be Sally. And I think the main issue with Sally, if we're being fair, is that she isn't built to have that road to being likable, redeemable, or feeling that she can be complicated. She at sometimes feels like Jax's adversary. She likes to pick with Jax, and it's not in a way that makes it feel like she's keeping Jax accountable or keeping her sharp. Oftentimes, she's just painted to be a hater. In terms of her divorce, yes, you can try to defend it by saying that what she did was for the sake of Chanel and her lifestyle, but because Chanel and Sally's relationship isn't built upon in this season or even in past seasons to the point where you see that love and care that she would go to bat for her like that, it didn't give her a path to get into your good graces and become someone you would invest in. And on top of that, Sally isn't the most funniest character. She doesn't have that passion for something when it comes to her work, which makes her someone you want to be invested in and want to see things happen with or to. So it ultimately just makes her feel like a character who should have just been Chanel's cousin who comes around but isn't necessarily pushed to be a notable part of the show, especially since it seems that based off of how they handled the characters this season, this is just not clear what she can really be of importance beyond potentially the sign that Bill really does love to be with black women. Which leads to the last low point, and that's just how Wendy was developed and handled. To me, I get it. Ozzy is the lead of the case. He is the client who is trying not to be sent to prison, if not worse. But the problem is, Wendy's the victim, and it feels like you should learn something about her, right? Yet, that doesn't happen in this show. We learn that she is Ozzy's stylist, that she has a sister, that she has an assistant. Her sister appears in one episode and then completely disappears. Her assistant sporadically appears, sometimes pokes the bear when it comes to Ozzy, but then when she's talking about really exposing Ozzy, he makes one phone call and she shuts the hell up. When she's put on the stand to come after Ozzy's character, Jax makes her shut the hell up. So it really feels like Wendy not only lacks defense, but it also lacks development in terms of you understanding why Ozzy fell in love with this one woman, especially considering his background with older women abusing him. You have a need to question of what makes her so special, so interesting, why her death should actually matter more or as much as Ozzy potentially going to jail because of her death. And granted, has the victim, or rather the person who's gotten killed, ever really been pushed to be someone who strongly mattered when it comes to reasonable doubt? Not necessarily, but with this situation, it feels like they could have gave Wendy more than just an actress with a name recognition. Which leads to the on-defense topics. First and foremost, the main thing we're kind of iffy about is the fact that Chanel got drastically reduced this season. After kind of stealing the show with the first season and then season 2 being focused on, now Chanel basically pops up a handful of times. Definitely is still on contract for the show, but it feels like she was too big to be written off, but at the same time was getting too big to the point that she was starting to compete with Jax and Lewis and becoming like co-lead. And part of me kind of gets why they had to pull her back, but at the same time, she had storylines that were in progress that we wanted to get updates on. Her mother-in-law may not have gotten the justice she wanted in the criminal case, but there's still the civil suit, never mind her wrestling over her son's money, which Chanel has now inherited. On top of that, they're still dealing with all the fallout from her being accused of killing a major celebrity, never mind a sports celebrity, and dealing with that, especially in terms of rebuilding her life. Yet, none of that gets touched whatsoever. Chanel pops in once or twice, checks in on Jax when she sees that Jax is smoking up a storm, and that's it. The next on the fence topic is definitely Jax's family. Whether it is her father showing up and all the back and forth drama that he brings, then her surprised little sister, and even Mama Lou to a point, it seems like more could have been done if their purpose was strictly to bring drama to this. Like, for example, Eddie comes back into Jax's life, and what Jax's stepfather did and what Mama Lou ignored, allowed, however you want to put it, it's never brought up. For him to potentially question to question Jax's upbringing, parenting, and then Mama Lou to possibly play the reverse Uno on him and maybe bring up how he didn't raise Jax, how she was doing the best she can, Jax possibly getting into that regarding what was her best and what it could be considered best or good enough or whatever. Never mind Chelsea going into her upbringing with Eddie, besides doing some subtle bad mouthing, but really getting into the details. Never mind potentially bridging the gap between when Eddie went off to rehab and basically exited Jax's life up till when he met Chelsea's mom and got involved with her. Then going to Chelsea's upbringing, then getting him all the way to being at Jax's door to try to get back into her life. Like, there's so much that you see could have been done with Eddie that could have been better. So much that could have been done with Chelsea that would have been better. And Mama Lou, the main frustration we have with her is that it's clear that there are some still lingering issues with Jax, especially when it comes to what Mama Lou did or didn't do. And then they build up to Mama Lou potentially dying this season, and then they chicken out of it. To me, teasing a character's gonna die and then backing out of it feels very cowardly, and it reminds me of when Jon Snow was supposed to die in Game of Thrones, but then they backed out of it. It feels too much like fan service that doesn't necessarily align with the story, and instead it just makes it feel like those behind the production don't trust that the viewers can handle what's going on. They can't handle potentially killing off a character that's notable. So instead, they kind of placate them and like give you a little scare, but then keep the person alive just so that they don't have to deal with potential backlash or any major issues. And granted, this is not me saying that I feel like the actress who plays Mama Lou should lose her job and a steady paycheck. More so, it just feels like many shows, especially black predominant ones, they do not fully utilize their cast members, especially ones who have notable filmographies, and it can often seem like they're just holding on to them with no real idea of what to do with them in a significant way. So when they do tease killing them off or actually doing something notable with them, it makes you want them to see it through rather than kind of hem and haw because they honestly just don't know what to do, but they're so glad that they was able to cast this one person. Which leads to the last on the fence and review topic, which is just how Ozzy's whole case played out. Because while Ozzy was a wonderful character and the way Cal Berry again played him was wonderful, unfortunately, just like the Chanel case, just like the Braden case, it felt like it was sped through too much. And because of all the other things happening in Jax's life, then if you have Sally's life, then what's in Louis' life, it's like as much as this trial should have been a major thing, it got truncated. So everything felt like it was fast paced and you didn't really get the full weight of this. Like one prime example is one of Jax's major worries when it came to this case was the court of public opinion, yet as much as Wendy's assistant might have been running her mouth, nobody really touched upon how court of public opinion was actually operating. We never really got to see how, in the long term, this whole case was going to affect Ozzy's career. Yes, there was science saying that he's a killer and other people saying he was innocent, but you never felt the weight and the depth of a celebrity being on a murder trial when it comes to this. And then when it came to everything else, when it came to his parents' relationship, his relationship with Monica, his agent and everything, it felt more like it wanted to mention these things and kind of touch upon them than really deep dive into them. Whether it's the complicated relationship that parents of a child star have with their kid, never mind how that affects their romantic relationship, how there's so many predators in the industry, and how it's not only these white children or white girls like we saw with the Nickelodeon documentary, but also how it affects the black kids who aren't just ignored but sometimes are preyed upon because they're so vulnerable, because there's such crabs in the barrel, feeling like there could only be one. And it's just all the different complications that could have went into this story just weren't. And it's kind of frustrating because there's not going to be another show similar to this where it's mostly black characters, black and brown, and they touch upon this type of story. So it kind of unfortunately puts on a tax when it comes to shows like Reasonable Doubt, because if they don't get it right, we're not going to see this type of story for years, if ever again. So with that in mind, you appreciate them doing this type of storyline, but also get frustrated because they're not going to do it justice. And unfortunately, they did not fully do Ozzy justice. But overall, when it comes to Reasonable Doubt Season 3, I appreciate what they did with Ozzy. I appreciate what they did with Lewis, and Jax is forever a favorite. But I do think that there's still this feeling that, like too many shows, it tries to do so much with so many characters that in a pursuit of quantity, it kind of loses quality for most. And on top of that, while I appreciate it taken away from what wasn't working and focusing on what was, there's still the matter of questioning, why did Sally's storyline or Chad's storyline get from script to screen? Never mind, can this show truly figure out a way to balance the drama that characters like Eddie brings and really give them the type of depth that is needed for them to not just be somewhere between stunt casting, trying to put on an actor who's had a notable long career, and really give universally each character a moment to shine, truly showcase their talent, and not just get a credit on their IMDb and lack any real memorable moment to make it so that they have additional credits once their time on the show is over.